Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Phil, and you are back on Fill in the Blanks again. My guest today is somebody I think you are going to really be fascinated by, a once-in-a-generation talent, somebody that is changing the world in ways that will benefit us all for decades to come, generations to come, because she's making changes that really have to do with redefining how people see themselves, particularly women. I'm talking about Reshma Saujani. She is building a pipeline of young women to work in computing and reshaping the global economy with her powerful, innovative, game-changing nonprofit, Girls Who Code. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. If you think this doesn't apply to you, it does. You may think, oh, I'm not going to be in computers or coding, but it's about so much more than that. She is the first Indian American woman to run for Congress, worked with the House and Senate to develop a, quote, Marshall Plan for moms in response to the crisis mothers have endured because of COVID. She served as New York City's deputy public advocate to support Dreamers and to help revise the nation's campaign finance laws. She serves on the board of overseers for Harvard University and the International Rescue Committee and serves on the board of trustees of the Economic Club of New York. That's just among her growing list of important responsibilities. She's also a wife and a mother in her spare time, like she's got any. She's been recognized by Forbes as one of the greatest leaders in the world. So we're just talking about somebody that is a mover and a shaker. I said it was not just tech. We're talking about a gender gap and supporting moms in the workplace and identifying ways to really reach economic empowerment, psychological empowerment for women. And this is really based on empirical evidence. Reshma, thank you so much for being here. I can't even begin to tell you how interesting that is to me and how many questions I've got for you.
Thank you, Dr. Phil, for having me. I've been a huge fan of yours, so it's wonderful to be here.
Well, I'm interested in talking about how you've conceptualized women in today's world. You also have a new book, Pay Up, The Future of Women and Work and Why It's Different Than You Think. And I want to talk about that, but I want to talk about you first. How did you get really interested in, and I'm not talking about the coding aspect and all of that, but the role of women? You talked a lot about how boys are raised one way and girls are raised another, and it's reflected in actual research studies about how boys and girls as early as the fifth grade react to challenges in a different way. What got you interested in all of this?
Well, I'm the daughter of refugees. My parents came to this country in 1973. They were expelled by the dictator Idi Amin. They were 2 of 1,000 refugees that got status to come to this country because they were engineers. My father, though, had to work as a machinist in a plant. My mother sold cosmetics. And my dad, when I was very little, he would read me these little Reader's Digest books about Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi. And there was something about hearing those stories when I was little about these change makers, these warriors, these people who were put on the earth to do something that stuck with me. And so I've always wanted to fight for people like my parents, vulnerable, poor, people who, others had counted out. And as we know, Dr. Phil, a lot of those are in our society and across the world are women and girls. And so there was something, I don't know, I've always been moved by the plight of women and girls. It's always been the people that I've wanted to fight for.
Do you think that's changing in America at least, or do you think there's still that big gender difference in the way they're treated and the way they see themselves?
I thought it was changing, and then the pandemic hit, and women are in crisis. Dr. Phil, the CDC reported that the second subgroup besides young people that have the highest levels of anxiety and depression are moms. Moms don't break. But there's something about the past 2 years in the pandemic. There's something about our public policies. There's something about our structure that we have in our society that is really pushing mothers to the limit. And, one of the things I've really been reflecting on, is the fact that like we just think that in our country or in America in some ways that like motherhood, parenthood is a personal choice. And so you don't get anything from your government, your society, your neighbor, your friends, your
Right.
workplace. But like you don't have a functioning society, that has a declining birth rate. Family values, being at family is like such a core part of what it means to be an American. And I think we've lost a little bit of that.
I think I'm way older than you. And so I've grown up through some different generations. And in the 50s, we were not a double income society to the degree we are now. I think now the statistics are high 70s, maybe
Yep.
even low 80s double income society, whereas in the 50s, it was maybe half that. So now we've got both parents working outside the home, bringing in income that the family relies on. And previously, families adjusted to living on one income, and the second income was what you fell back on if something happened.
Right.
Somebody got sick or a job was lost or unexpected things came up. Then that second partner would get a job and bridge the gap. But now we're a largely double income society, and 100% of those two incomes are being absorbed. So there's no cushion
Right.
there, but women are a vital part of the family's economic lifeline. That's really showing the pay gap, right? Because they're
Yeah.
out there in the workplace, but working for less.
That's right. That's right. Women are not a nice to have in the workforce. They're a must have. But the problem is, Dr. Phil, we built workplaces on the fact that we've treated women as a nice to have. So, we have work days that are 9 to 5 and school days that are 8 to 3. Because back in, like you said, in the 50s, he was at work and she was at home and she could pick up the kids. Now it doesn't work that way. And so all of society is based on an outdated model that no longer exists. And who's picking up the slack? Women. And the pandemic really exposed this. So like when schools shut down, a lot of families in America treat schools, I know my parents did, as daycare centers.
Of course.
And so when schools shut down and you still had to work, you had no system of care. And, when we created this thing where you had to like log in your kid at Zoom, I have a kindergartner. I can't be like, hey, Sean, log yourself on. See you later. No, I got to be right there with him while I'm trying to keep my job. And so when that happened, it was women that were doing that unpaid labor, that homeschooling, the cooking, the cleaning, the putting on your mask, making sure you wiped off everything, right? Just in case the virus, all of that while you were maintaining your full-time job. And nobody was looking at this saying, whoa, we got to rethink this.
I can't cite the study, so I'll talk about this anecdotally, but there are studies out there to this, and if people can find them and send them to me, I'll appreciate it. But I recall a study from many years ago that looked at the number of steps, the number of activities that stay-at-home moms did compared to mothers working outside the home. And it wasn't totally isomorphic, but very close to the number of steps, the number of movements and activities that stay-at-home moms did compared to mothers working outside the home. And so these people that think, well, stay-at-home moms, they just kind of sit around on the couch and eat bonbons all day. Not true.
Nope.
What it amounts to is a working mom goes and does what she does. Then when she gets through with that, she has another full-time job that she does on top of the job that she leaves the home and does. So it's like 2 full-time jobs.
Yep.
When you said that the pandemic has shown them to be the second group that has been impacted by increases in anxiety, depression, stress, loneliness, even some learned helplessness creeping in there, that's absolutely borne out by the statistics. And I think it is because of this feeling of I'm now overwhelmed. I've got the financial pressure, jobs are lost, my children are showing emotional problems, regression, depression, anxiety. Here I'm trying to keep all of this together and can't do it. And so many of these women can't do their job working at home because it's a service job, just like a lot of men that drive a truck or they're working with their hands or whatever. They can't do it from home. They have to be on site to do it. So that creates tremendous anxiety.
That's right. And I think the thing that we told ourselves before, at least I certainly did, is he just doesn't know. I married one of the good ones. I made sure that I married someone who did the cooking, the cleaning, all that stuff, right? But then when we had a kid, when we had my first son, Sean, I took my maternity leave and he didn't. And then suddenly I knew where all the stuff was, right? And so my to-do list went like this and his shrunk. And it is the constant thing that we argue about, right? 1/3 of divorces are about the chores. But part of it was, I think for a lot of us, we told ourselves, well, our partners just don't know. They just don't know all the things that we do. And then we got locked in the house with them. And they saw us doing our laundry in between our Zoom meetings. They saw everything that we were doing and how much we were doing. The whole world did. Our president did.
Yes.
But no one said, oof, not just thank you. Thank you for saving our country. But also this isn't fair. This isn't right. We got to rethink this. And, the reality is that, if we know that we need women's labor for the economy, and that in order to do that, and that women are doing 2/3 of caregiving work, they're doing 2.5 jobs before they do their full-time job. We need to be thinking about what are the structures that we can put into place, that can actually support working women and working families, with this domestic work. So I think you always think about what are the silver linings of crises, and this is the silver lining of it, because the reality is nobody wants to have kids. Young women look at me and they're like, no, thank you. And as you know, a society that has a declining birth rate is a dying society.
Is that the reason you think? Do you think that's the reason there's a decline? How do you assess that?
I think it's all about the cost. I mean, think about it. I think about my parents, they were refugees. My mother couldn't afford the $50 a week for childcare. And so from the time that I was 10, I was a latchkey kid. My sister would pick me up at middle school. We would run home, lock the door, right? Because back then it's we were terrified someone's going to kidnap us.
Right.
I think about my mother and how she felt sitting at her work at 2:45, thinking about her babies running home by themselves. But the point is that so many families have always had to make these unconscionable choices. A story I talk about in my book, Pay Up, about a mom who had to go to work at a pizza parlor. She didn't have childcare. So she left her kids at home and she got put in jail for child endangerment. So, we don't give families slack, and the cost of childcare has just skyrocketed. In New York City, it used to be $15 for a babysitter. Now it's $25. So,
Wow.
it's the largest cost center of, so many families. And so it is also an economic issue. You basically work to work and not work to live. And we got to restructure society so that we work to live and not work to work.
That's an interesting way to put it. You work to work. And of course, those women that men that work in daycare centers, they deserve to have a great wage as well, because we're turning over to them our greatest assets. I mean, That's what I say about teachers. I can't even hardly look teachers in the eye. I mean, we're turning over our children to these people for 40% of their waking hours, and we pay them such ridiculous wages. I don't know a teacher that doesn't get in their own pocket to get materials for the classroom, whether it's construction paper or colors or markers. Teachers don't do it for the money. Right. Let's put it that way. They're getting in their own pocket to facilitate their classrooms. So we clearly have to pay these daycare centers a good wage if we want quality people there. It's tough all the way around. We also have to focus on what we're teaching these kids when they're in school or when they're in daycare. And that's what I was saying. You say there's this gender difference, not just about the job they're doing, it's about the values they're being taught. You made a big distinction about the difference of young women and girls being taught to strive for perfection and young boys being taught bravery. That was a big difference to you. Talk about that a little bit, because I really want people to hear your take on that. It's very interesting.
So, a couple of years ago, I get asked to do a TED Talk. And like I said, I've been working on fighting for women and girls my whole life, led my first march when I was 13. And so I wanted to take that opportunity to get on that stage and say something about gender equality that like may put the conversation in a different perspective. And I run an organization, Girls Who Code. We have taught 500,000 girls to code across the country. I got Girls Who Code clubs in every county, town, and parish, from like Kansas to Nebraska to Atlanta, I mean, everywhere. And, when girls come to our programs to learn how to code, none of them have coded before. And so you're coming in with no knowledge. And during that first week, every teacher would tell me the same story. She'd say a student would come in her class and she'd look at her teacher and she'd say, I don't know what code to write. And the teacher would look at her computer screen and she'd see a blank text editor. So if she didn't know any different, she thought that her student spent the past 10 minutes just staring at the screen. But when the teacher pressed undo a few times, she saw that her student actually wrote code, but then deleted it. So instead of showing the progress that she made or saying, hey, I wrote this, but I think I made a mistake, she rather showed nothing at all. So it's this idea of perfection or bust. I tell this story on the TED stage. I walk off and I am inundated. 6 million people watch this talk, and I'm with women who say, I do this too. With dads who say, my daughter does this too. With girls who say, and it didn't matter whether you were a teacher or a doctor, a dancer or an artist, black, white, straight, gay, somewhere along the line, you had learned how to delete the code of your life. And what I mean by that is somewhere along the line, you had learned how to give up before you even try. And I wanted to understand, is that true? And if it is, when did you learn it? And can you unlearn it? And so, I wrote my last book, Brave Not Perfect, about this. And I learned it is true. Go to any playground in America and you'll see what I'm talking about. We tell our boys to like climb to the top of the monkey bars and then just jump head first. But with our girls, it's like, be careful, honey. Don't swing too high. Did you take that toy away from her? Give it back. And what happens when girls are born, we want to wrap them up with bubble wrap. A friend of mine just had a baby and she's teaching her how to walk and she's like walking behind her and she's like, be careful, honey, be careful, honey. And she's like, and then your voice came and I changed it to like, go baby, right? But it's like this instinct that we have to physically protect our girls. And then around 8 or 9, that physical protection extends to emotional protection. So when our daughter comes home from gymnastics and is crying because she can't do a cartwheel, we say, don't worry, honey, I'm going to put you into soccer. And so what happens is that young women get addicted to perfection and they gravitate toward the things that they're good at. And that addiction to perfection, that not building resiliency, that not learning how to fail has huge consequences on every aspect. So, in education, women get a B, declare economics as a major and get a B in their introductory level course, they drop out. Whereas boys are like, I got a D, I'm running for president, right? Completely different result. You see it in mental health, as you know, Dr. Phil, right? The rates of suicide, anxiety, and depression, much higher for girls, than they are for boys. And you see it in leadership, where men apply for a job if they meet 60% of the qualifications, and women don't even apply unless they meet 100%. So if we're waiting, to be perfect to lead, if we're waiting to be perfect to live, we're never going to close the leadership gap. And I think the antidote to perfectionism is bravery.
This difference between bravery and perfection, and I've never looked at it from a gender different standpoint, but I've always told myself and everybody I work with that we strive for excellence, not perfection, because perfection is kind of an excuse to sit on the sidelines.
Right.
It's like, oh, this essay isn't perfect, this picture isn't perfect, this project isn't perfect. That just gives you an excuse to not get in the game. Whereas if you strive for excellence, you just put it out there and you see what you got. But I'm really wondering if what your take is on what we're doing in colleges and universities today with young people in terms of preparing them for the competition of the real world. Because I always looked at universities as a place where we went for an exchange of ideas. It's a place where we went to hear someone that thought differently than ourselves,
Mm,
where we went to have an honest intellectual exchange, debate, discourse. Now, a third of students think it's okay to yell down someone, the speaker that
yeah.
differs from your point of view. They demonstrate against having someone on campus that disagrees with them. They complain to administration if a professor or instructor has a different point of view and advances a course curriculum that requires them to resolve cognitive dissonance by taking the other side in an argument. We create safe spaces. We do those sort of things instead of causing them to deal with discord. I wonder what you think about that.
When I was at Harvard and I got my master's, the Taliban came to speak. And I think I'm so happy that I got to sit in that room and listen to what they had to say. Because I think the only way that you can fight and that you can be an activist and that you can shift is to understand what people who are diametrically opposed to what you believe say. I wrote an op-ed the other day about abortion. 6 out of 10 women who get an abortion are mothers. And there's been a lot of interesting comments on my feed. Now, I don't delete them, I read them, every single one. And so I think and from my perspective, I want to give the opposing side room. I want to have relationships. I want to break bread with people who don't believe what I believe, because that's the only way that we can really, really, really push and re-examine, our own argument and our own viewpoint. And the reality is, especially in this country's so divided, but it's so also not divided, because we push people to the opposing sides rather than try to find a common ground. And I think that radically has to change. It's because the thing is, it's like, it's not actually building, like, it's kind of like what I say about failure. Like, I'm obsessed with Serena Williams. And, Serena Williams sits at the edge of her ability and a coach who's saying, do it again, do it again, do it again. The only way you can be great is if you do it again and do it again and do it again. Now, the only way I can be a great social servant, a warrior, a change maker, is if I really understand what is driving people to believe what they believe and how do I get them to come over here a little bit, right? Like, so if I spent all my time talking to women, if I spent all my time talking to girls, I would never know how to change the behavior of men. I spend most of my time talking to men and audiences that may not, and you know what? Guess what? Now 50% of girls who code teachers are men. Half of my board are men. My first 3 funders to my Marshall Plan for Moms are men, right? Because the only way we're going to get to equality is with men as our allies and as our partners in crime. But that means that we got to have a lot of conversations, a lot.
Yeah, if people had that attitude, we would be having a lot of these conversations that aren't being had right now. I'm not saying that we should all just get together and have a group hug. There are legitimate differences, and people should embrace those differences, but you have to discuss them and find some way to recognize you're not going to get everything you want. You're not going to give everything they want. You've got to find a way to compromise and live with it. I'm not saying everybody should just say, oh, well, we'll
No,
just all get together and live in harmony. That will probably never happen,
no.
that you have harmony on things like abortion or issues that have to do with literally life or death. There are going to be philosophical differences, religious differences, social differences, and you may never get to a point of agreement on that, but there's got to be some way to coexist, and you're
Yeah.
never going to find that if you don't talk about it.
Well, it's ironic, we got to a place, during the Trump years where almost it was a point of pride to distance yourself from a family member or stop speaking to a family member who didn't have the same political viewpoint as you. And that's not pride. That's sad. And so, we got to move around move away from that as being a badge of the, again, the integrity that we have to our convictions and our ideas. Because the reality is I think a point of, I think when you've really made difference is when you have moved someone's opinion. They may not move all the way, but they've said, okay, I didn't think about it that way. And I think that is like really, really, really critical. I do think on college campuses that like I went to the Kennedy School of Government. I heard a lot of people who didn't believe what I believed. And honestly, so much of who I am today and what I've learned and what I've built is by listening to the opposing side. I just think it's the only way that you grow, that you learn.
But what's the message to parents of young girls? How do they do that? How do they instill that in them?
Stop protecting them. Stop protecting them. That's what a friend of mine was telling me a story about her father when she was 8. I think he was in the military. One day he just walked in and he just took her pillow. I was like, you don't need it anymore. Like, it's like that kind of just tough. Like, we coddle our kids. We protect them. If they forget to bring their homework at school, we don't know what it feels, let them feels like to make a mistake or to not get picked. Like we're like, I still have parents, who call me for their daughters to write recommendation letters for them. I'm like, they're 18. They can email me. So it's just like, we gotta stop that. I again grew up with like immigrant parents that were working class. They didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't in sports. I mean, they didn't know where I applied to college. They didn't read my recommendation letter. Nothing. And I turned out fine. So I just think this whole intensive parenting, this over coddling, we're literally building zero resiliency in our children. And then we wonder why they're medicated. We wonder why, they're not able to deal with strife.
See, that's what I worry about with the generation in the universities right now, not just women, but these kids that are not being required to do some of the things that generations before them have done. They're not having to take the other position. They're not having to deal with adversity. If I have 2 applicants in front of me, and one of them has a college degree and the other does not, but they're matched in every way other than that. Same intelligence, same work history, same whatever, matched the same way. I used to always say I would opt for the college graduate, even if it was an irrelevant degree to what I was looking for, because I knew one thing about them I didn't know about the other. I knew they could set a long-term goal. They could stay focused on that goal across 4 or 5 years. I knew they could get along with people. I knew they could put up with professors they didn't like, and it was their job to get along with the professor, not the professor's job to get along with them. I knew they could get projects in on time. I knew they could do what it took to get through a degree. I don't know that about college graduates anymore. I really don't. It seems like the system is bending itself to them as much as them bending themselves to the demands of the system, at least not nearly as much as it seemed like it was a generation ago or 2 generations ago. And I think we're coddling them too much.
Yeah, but I think it's shifted. Listen, I think, where did that come from? Some of that did come from the fact of that technology. We had so much misinformation and disinformation that we felt like we had to coddle and protect, infantilize our children and just people, to not be able to kind of make their own decisions and come up with their own conclusions. And I think that, when I meet young people today, they're actually very well researched, meaning like they really go out there and see every piece of it. So it's funny, like as they come up to you can't like just tell them things and they'll believe it. They really do like ask questions and think about it. So in some ways, maybe colleges haven't caught up to where kids are at. And I think that we just, again, have to like infuse a culture where if you really want to make a difference on climate change, you got to actually sit in the room and listen to climate deniers. Because the only way you get stronger in your convictions and make the difference that you need to make is when you hear the opposing point of view. And I think that is just a shift, right, that we have to continue to say and make to people.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I've met with a lot of college students in the last year, And there are things about them that bother me. But one of the things I've noticed is they are so smart.
They're so smart.
They are so damn smart. They have so much information at their fingertips, and they have the command of that information. If they will just get a transmission, if they'll just get into gear, they are so smart. I just know if they will get that part of it solved, I feel good about the future of mankind because they got so much information and they're so smart and so articulate. Boy, they can make an argument.
But this is what I find. That's why I don't know if it's the kids saying, I don't want to hear from the Taliban. I think it's maybe the adults. Because I actually think because they actually believe, like you have the wisdom to, go through the information, decide for their own what is true and what is not true. Again, if I think that they would want to hear all sides, all pieces, again, just to get stronger in your conviction or to learn. So I don't know. I think that is something. I think the pendulum is swinging on that. I really do. I do think that this generation is exceptionally bright.
That's what has jumped out at me is how really bright they are. I want to save some time for a minute to talk about your new book. And by the way, Reshma did not ask me to even bring this book up, so she isn't here to promote a book. This is something that I wanted to talk about, and it's Pay Up, the Future of Women in Work. You talk about the big lie of corporate feminism. Describe what you call the big lie.
Yeah, listen, I found myself in the pandemic with 2 little kids, I had a newborn baby, a 6-year-old. I was, working on my Girls Who Code, my organization. And, when the pandemic hit, everything fell apart. I had to homeschool my kindergartner, save take care of my newborn baby, and then save my nonprofit from being shut down. And all of my leadership team were just working parents. And a lot of us were saying, well, just hold on a second, because when the schools open, everything will be fine. And when the schools didn't open and they came up with this thing of like hybrid learning where we'd get to log on our kids all the while we maintain our full-time job, I about lost my mind. Because the thing was, I naively thought, well, aren't they going to ask us if we have the time to do that, to work and to take care and to homeschool our kids? And could they have come up with a different decision like other countries did, right? And then, you saw millions of women, leave the workforce overnight like this. I mean, women who had been studying to be nurses, and had to go to Uber driving, move in with their parents, become dreams just dying on the vine. Children, not being able to find food, put food on the table. Again, as you said, 50% of women are the breadwinners. 3 out of 10 American families are run by single moms. I mean, this was big.
And you said globally that there were $800 billion in wages lost from women dropping out of the workforce during this pandemic time.
Yeah, because if you're mom and it's your kids or your job, you're picking your kids. And we were forced, because of the policy decisions that we made in this country, to, have to, again, supplement our unpaid labor for paid labor. And there weren't a lot of options. I mean, also, half the daycare centers were shut down. The schools were shut down. Maybe you were relying on your parents. Now they're elderly. You don't want them to get COVID. So you were left without any choices. Women were left. Families were left without any choices. And, that's what inspired me to write this book and to, ignite my next movement, Marshall Plan for Moms. Because, listen, the most important title I have is mother. It's the one I fought the hardest for. It's the one that I am the proudest about. And, I believe that we got to live in a society that respects moms, that lifts them up, that praises them, and that we create, social structures that make it possible for you to work and have a job. I mean, for you to be a mom and have a job. And we don't make it. We make it so hard. And, we got to ask ourselves why. How can we change that?
So many women, you said unemployment rose to nearly 15% during this time, and it's the lowest participation since 1988. What I worry about, just selfishly for the country, is think about the talent that has dropped out of the workforce. What the hell? Think about all the brain power, the talent, the creativity, everything that has dropped out of the workforce. What do you do to replace that?
Well, listen, a lot of women are in jobs like retail, education, healthcare. A lot of those jobs are automated because of the pandemic. And so I'd like to see, a national retraining program that helps women, get back into the labor force. So we have got to we also got to stop fighting this flexibility, remote work. I mean, if you're a shift worker and, you show up at your job at Walmart and now you've put your kid in babysitter, you show up and your shift is canceled, you're out money. We got to give women predictability, right? Over this, that to me, you can build an app that allows people to shift schedules with one another. So again, how are we making it possible for women to work? And again, not work just to work, right?
Right.
And so to me, a lot of these things, Phil, I talk about in my book are real fixes that are not that expensive, that companies can make. And that I think will really change the lives of American families for the better.
Well, but this is a corporate culture thing. This is something that
It
has to be interwoven into the culture. It's not something that awareness helps. This is something that has to be a company commitment, a company policy, that when a woman takes a job there, moves her career in that direction, she's got to know this is part of what I have.
Yep. Well, in the moment we're in right now is a great resignation. 4 million people are quitting every month. And they're quitting not because they don't want to work. They just want to work for you. And, and I think what people are looking for is a company that has family values. I think they're looking for companies that are going to help subsidizing with childcare. I just launched a National Business Childcare Coalition, with a handful of companies that agree that what they're hearing from their employees is that people need help paying for their childcare and that they can't work unless they have help paying for their childcare. It's not a personal problem. It's a business problem. And so, when you think about childcare in this country, most people, they pay more for their childcare than they pay for their mortgage. It's the largest cost center for families. And so if you're my employer and you want me to work, and then I need support with, and the companies pay for other things. They pay for museum memberships or IVF or, other things. So childcare can be something that it's a business issue.
And I wonder if it is a great resignation or if it's the great relocation. You talk about all the people that have resigned, but look at the numbers of the people that have gone to work. I think those people are just moving jobs, like you say. They're going somewhere that they feel
they're going somewhere. Yep.
They feel appreciated. Yeah.
And that works with their lives. I just think that men, women, they don't want to commute 2 hours a day. They don't want to work at a place where if their kid is sick, they're going to get fired if they say I need an hour. So it is really about, we have gotten more connected also, I think, with each other and with our families and what's important to us. And, I think that drive, like you said, that drive, we've asked ourselves, well, what's the point of all this? So I think that companies who get it, my mom and dad worked at the same company for 30 years and their boss knew my name, came to my graduation. I went, had company picnics. I mean, it's so interesting. I just feel like in the past couple of years before the pandemic, we stopped treating people as people and started treating them as expendable. And so in return, a lot of people quit their jobs within 9 months. Nobody stays anywhere anymore.
We have a philosophy at Dr. Phil from day one called Family First. I've always told people that are associated with the show, look, if there's that piano recital, if there's that Christmas program, if there's that baseball game, they may not make eye contact if you're there, but trust me, if your seat's empty, they'll see it for sure. We're not curing cancer here. We're making television. You got maybe 2 kids. You need to be there. We do 175 shows a year. We'll be fine. You know what? Once they got that was for real, nobody took advantage of that. I've heard people say, oh my God, my people, they'd have something every day they had to go to. That never happened.
Yeah.
They all said, hey, thank you for that. And they did. They were there for their kids. And our people have been here 20 years. I've seen their kids born, go up now and go off to college and stuff. And it makes such a difference. That's why people stay instead of move around all the time. You talk about these things and you say there are 4 key steps to creating lasting change. Empower working women, educate corporate leaders, revise our narratives about what it means to be successful, which we were just talking about a little bit, and advocate for policy reform. You talk a lot about that in this book, and I really want people to pick this up. Again, it's Pay Up, The Future of Women in Work, and Why It's Different Than You Think. You take some really novel angles of approach to this. I think people are, particularly women, and hopefully leaders that want to keep their workforce motivated and together are going to really find this compelling. So I really advocate for people reading this book. I think they're going to love it. Look on her backlist as well, because she wrote Brave, Not Perfect, which we talked about earlier. And this would be two great books for you to read. And if you've got daughters, you really want to read this. And if you're a manager and you want to keep your workforce motivated, and that chip on the shoulder is a good thing, right? It's worked for you. Will you run for office again?
When they stop being so crazy over there, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe. I mean, it's just, I feel like God put me on this earth to be a warrior. And so I'm always looking for what's the best way that I can serve the people. And I've been serving them this way, outside of the system, helping mothers, helping girls. And, right now, I just don't think you can make the same kind of change in Washington. But maybe one day when it changes, I may be ready.
Well, I think everything you're doing would prepare you to do that, but you're certainly making a lot of noise outside the system. So I hope you keep doing what you're doing, because it sure makes a lot of sense. And nobody can look at what you're saying and argue with the sense of it or the impact of it. That's why I started this out by saying, if they heard me saying, here's someone that's going to talk about coding, computer work, that would be such a disservice if they went, oh, doesn't apply to me. That's why I was saying that, not to trivialize the importance of that, but just because you talk about so much more. And you've done it very well today. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about all of this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Huge deal. Let's talk again.
I would love that.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You bet. So long.